there are a lot of requirements on these teams. It's not just the in-store, retail now. I mean, it's everything. And I think what we're seeing is now more dedicated people to each of these areas.
Welcome to Winning with Walmart. My name is Matt Pfeiffer, and I'm excited to be joined today by an old friend. We go back almost 20 years together from my past life in the startup community, and his as well in some ways. But Mike Whittington is the founder and president of Matchpoint Recruiting, and I'm so excited to have him here today. He and his team put out a quarterly report for the Walmart supplier community to sort of give a lay of the land on what's happening, and he's joined me today to have a conversation about what they've seen in the first quarter. So, Mike, welcome.
Thanks, Matt. It's good to be here. Appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, it's great to see you. And we've got a number of questions that I'm going to try to get through. But at the end, for anyone that sticks around, we're going to open it up for Q&A. So as you join, if you've got any questions, and I'll say this periodically as we go, but as you've got questions for Mike, just hit that Q&A button at the bottom or the chat, either one. And we'll see those questions as they come in, and we'll make sure we save some time at the end. But Mike, my first question, from your vantage point in Bentonville, what is Q1? Why does Q1 2026 feel materially different from that of Q1 in 2025?
I think it's just kind of a sense of normalcy, and people just kind of get back to what we've had as a job market. The past few years have been really, really tough. And the conversations that we have with hiring managers and with candidates seems to be much more positive. And hopefully we are going in the right direction now. We're having more conversations with clients about future hires, which is always a really good sign. There were just so many, reorgs last year and downsizings that, the market just has to absorb all of that. And we're kind of getting to that point now so that hopefully things are positive moving forward.
Yeah. So much of 2025 was marked by paused searches and delayed approvals. What specifically changed inside organizations?
Well, actually 2025 really started off really well. There was still some concerns, still were concerns about inflation. Those were there, but things were poised to go up. And then about the start of the second quarter, we had tariffs jump in there. And when that came about, I think companies kind of tapped the brakes a little bit. That continued through the second and third quarter, really. And it just changed the whole hiring market.
Yeah. Q4 then became the strongest quarter of the year. What does that tell you about supplier confidence coming into 26?
Actually, we think it has more to do with how companies really managed tariffs and managed inflation. That it just went for so long where it's just really a moving target. It still could be to some extent, but these are critical positions on the Walmart account. And I think we just got to a point where they said, look, we have to fill these positions. For the most part, it's the biggest customer. We just can't let these go. And so we were very, very active in the fourth quarter.
Yeah. Where do you find that teams are still cautious, and what roles are not getting approved?
I think a majority of roles are getting approved. They're just being a little bit more cautious altogether. There was probably a little bit of overhiring when COVID was over. And so what I think we're seeing now is just companies being a little bit more purposeful, making sure it's the right position, and they're really ready to pull the trigger in adding this person to the team. It's not just filling the head count, anymore. The word that we hear the most is measured. It's moving forward, but they're making measured decisions right now.
Yeah. So if someone wants to understand where the supplier community is headed right now, what roles should they be watching as leading indicators?
I think two roles that really stand out to me are omni-channel and anything really related to shopper insights. Those areas have just evolved so much over the last few years. I can remember back when they weren't around, and you see just very, very complex job descriptions now, and I think that's a good indication. Where these positions go, kind of determine what these teams are going to look like in the future.
Does current hiring activity signal stability, pressure, or opportunity inside supplier organizations?
I think it can be a combination of all three,
Hmm.
really. I think we could have some stability now, a little bit more stability, based on the Supreme Court decision last week, but it could still also be a moving target to some degree. I think, the other thing is that the suppliers feel pressure. They're having to keep up. There's just more requirements now. So they do feel that pressure. And I think if they're getting the right people on their team to handle that pressure, I mean, it could be a great opportunity for growth.
Why would you say customer-facing sales roles tied to daily retailer engagement are receiving steady demand?
I would say, like account manager roles have stayed pretty much in demand. I think it's, companies are, focused on growing their business, not just maintaining it. And, a lot of times that's the person they have in front of the buyer. And we haven't really seen where that job has just gone away by any means. I think the job descriptions for those roles has become, they've had many more requirements on there, for national account managers that, they're wearing a lot of hats now on it. And I think it's just important for companies to have the right person there representing the company, to Walmart.
What operational needs are driving continued demand for scintilla-based analytical support?
I think supplier teams are just overwhelmed with data right
Mm.
now. It just seems to be that they're constantly talking about it, and I get it. And many of the sales, like the team leads, will tell us, "Hey, we've got all this data. We don't know what to do with it. We don't know what it means." And so then you have, these data analysts and, scintilla people that are really able to come in and give that information, to the sales team. It's just a much more data driven world. And I think it's really impacting suppliers. And then we're seeing that as a result of some very specific positions like scintilla experts.
Hybrid category management and shopper insights roles are appearing more frequently. What problems are companies trying to solve with those roles?
I'd say it's still, about the kind of the why behind shopper behavior. Those roles have kind of mixed up over the years. I remember back when category management was just purely, shelf space and using pro space. It's become more about what the shopper is really looking for. I think that's
Mm.
always going to be a moving target. So you're going to see that position in demand quite a bit. And I think, as a result, you'll see suppliers putting much more of a focus on these positions moving forward. All size companies, I think
Yeah.
that shopper behavior is so important. Like years ago, we didn't have like dedicated e-commerce people, and now we're seeing that across the board. I think we'll see the same thing with insights.
Where are you seeing supplier teams under investing relative to the complexities that they now face?
As a recruiter, I'm going to say people, on there. But to invest in people and give them what they need to be successful is crucial. And we've gone through something over the last 2 or 3 years. We call it piling on. And what that basically means is not only is someone wearing many hats, they're wearing a lot of hats. And an example would be like if we had let's say a 10-person team, someone leaves that company, promoted, whatever. Now 9 people are taking over taking over the role, the work of 10. And it just kind of compounds over time. Now maybe a couple more people leave. Instead of backfilling the position, everybody's filling in. It's sustainable for a while, but that's usually when we start getting calls, when people are just overwhelmed, they don't have the resources. And I think we need to see more investment in people and giving them what they need to be successful in their role. We get calls about that all the time, and that's, I guess, why I'm a little bit more passionate about it, because there's certain things that candidates tell us that they're having issues with at work, and that seems to be one of them, is just the support.
Online grocery obviously continues to grow a meaningful rate. How does that show up in hiring decisions?
Well, online grocery has taken off so much since COVID. And, I remember back then when companies were just saying, "Hey, we're trying to figure it out." And I think a lot of companies have figured it out. I think it's also just another thing that's evolving in the supplier community. And, companies are getting better at it. But I also think it's going to be something that we see a lot more in job descriptions too. Even anything to do with omni-channel, e-commerce, These are just all really kind of almost new channels, and I think it's just going to continue to grow. I think in future job descriptions with food companies, I think online grocery experience is going to be a requirement for many of the roles.
What are some of the new operational pressures that omni-channel growth is creating for supplier teams?
I think the biggest issue is just there's just so much there. There are growth opportunities, but just figuring it out. I mean, it really is like it's just all new channels really there. So there are a lot of requirements on these teams. It's not just the in-store, retail now. I mean, it's everything. And I think what we're seeing is now more dedicated people to each of these areas. As I mentioned, like on e-com, like years ago, there wasn't an e-com manager or someone who is, working, just in the store, direct store NAM would basically handle the e-com too. I think now we're going to see much more dedicated people across omni-channel. I think it's going to make the structure of the teams look a lot different. I think teams are going to grow as a result.
Do you find that most supplier organizations are structurally built for this complexity, or are they still adapting?
I think they're still adapting. It's hard for me to say on that, honestly. We're adapting. We are, even in the recruiting world, we're constantly trying to learn, what these suppliers are going through. And we hear stories, and we're trying to learn ourselves. And I think everybody is just kind of in that adapting mode right now, whether it's from the data, whether it's from Scintilla, Omnichannel, just all of this together it is an evolving market. And it's important for suppliers to stay on target with this, and keep up with it. But it's tough for us too. We're trying to stay on top of what suppliers are looking for. And I think just the whole supplier community now is just has to adapt. Funny thing with hiring managers, adaptability is one of the things we see quite a bit in job descriptions, and I think, thinking quickly on your feet and adapting and learning new things is just going to continue for all of us, really.
As well. Mike, let's talk about compensation and market dynamics. Is Bentonville employer driven or candidate driven entering, in the first quarter of 2026? That's an interesting question.
I would definitely say it's employer driven. And in our opinion, it has been employer driven since before COVID, really. And what that means is really the employer right now has more leverage. There have been more people in the market. We've had more, downsizings and different things since COVID and the tariffs. And, the supplier community was really poised for really big growth, I think, right about when COVID hit. We had these moves between employer driven or candidate driven every few years. And right before COVID hit, it was really, really ready to go to the candidate side. We wait a few, then we're ready to go with tariffs, and the same thing happens. And so I think we're going to move to more candidate driven. It's just going to be a slower process. I don't know if it'll happen this year, but I think we're going to move in that direction.
How are compensation structures evolving? Base salary, incentive structure, flexibility. What are you seeing?
Well, over the last few years, compensation has gone up in this market quite a bit from what we see. Now, you would think it would be the opposite with the downsizing and the reorgs and the people there, but I think it's just, Walmart is just so important here that, most companies are not going to shortchange someone. I mean, I feel like the salaries have gone up. There could be a little bit of that in there, whether there's the piling on, where they're paying more because the person is wearing, doing the job of two. But compensation has stayed steady and really kind of grown in some areas over the last 2 or 3 years. You ask about flexibility too. And that's an interesting topic because it means different things to different people, really. And flexibility, some people think of it as working from home. Some think of it as hybrid. Some think of it as, just being able to go to the dentist when they need to. And I think what we've landed on is a lot of companies and candidates are kind of landing in the hybrid mode there. Now, that doesn't mean everybody, but if you're a company and you're asking everybody to come in 8 to 5, you're probably not seeing the full talent pool on it. And if you're a candidate only looking at remote positions, you're probably not going to see all of the opportunities in there. So I think most companies have to be a little bit flexible, and so do candidates, in this market.
Mike, where are you seeing companies most often misprice roles or mishandle offers?
I'd say on mishandled offers, it's there at the offer stage, really. When maybe a verbal is given, I think that's where a lot of things can kind of fall apart. There could be delays, which can concern the candidate. At the offer stage, I always joke about having companies have the offer, everything ready before the search even starts, so that when you end, you're ready to go on it, and maybe just filling in the numbers at that point. But what we see a lot of times is they go through the process, they find the candidate, then we have to wait on signatures, may have to wait on benefits information. There could be some holdups in HR, and that's really the time where we should, both parties should be crossing the finish line relatively quickly. But I think that's the area that most companies are the least prepared for.
We're with Mike Whittington, founder and president of Matchpoint Recruiting. Mike would never agree with me on this, but one of the people that I think can take a lot of responsibility for how the Walmart supplier community has developed over the past couple of decades. We're real grateful to have him here. Mike, let's talk about some questions from a candidate's perspective. Mm-hmm. What capabilities are now non-negotiable for professionals that are supporting Walmart and Sam's Club?
It's almost moving to that point where, they're going to have experience, in e-com some way, scintilla. I mean, you'd be surprised where we see that on job descriptions, at the different levels that really aren't, using scintilla day to day. But I think you're seeing, some of these things. It's the best example I could have would be like years ago when we used to put Microsoft Office, and now you got to know it, or Excel, you've got to know retail math. You've got to know these things. And I think we're going to see that in many more areas. It would not surprise me actually, if we start seeing some job descriptions that say, more of how did you handle supply chain issues during COVID? Or, did you have issues with tariffs, with your previous company? Because some of those fires that you have to put out are really good building blocks for someone's career, but very beneficial for some of these teams to have members on there. So I think the requirements are just going to grow bigger.
What would you say separates top tier candidates from those that are average in interviews today?
In interviews, I think a top candidate can go into an interview. They're very confident, but they don't just talk about what they've done. They really try to come in and show their value, their immediate value. And I think the biggest thing that we see is that the top candidates go in there and really not just talk about why they're qualified, but they're giving examples of their work and showing how they're more qualified than the other 50, 200 people that are being, that want that job. And they're setting themselves apart, which I know can be a little bit challenging sometimes, bragging on yourself, but they're going in there and they're setting themselves apart on purpose. And it's pretty obvious from what we see.
What positioning mistakes are quietly costing candidates opportunities today?
Well, I would say like resumes. Mm-hmm. Resumes are killing candidates right now. And it's really an odd phenomenon. We're probably seeing over 50% of the resumes that we get have issues that don't allow that candidate to really stand out. And I understand it, because a lot of people in the supplier community are doing awesome things, but they think it's just kind of part of the job on it. Yeah. And so they don't put the details in there. And it's small things. And so getting that resume, we always say not good, but great, sets you apart. And that's what gets the interview. And I think most people through their career at some point need professional help with that. But we see things like that are just great things that people have done or have that experience that could be something like they have experience with private label, licensing, worked with Asian manufacturers. All of that stuff is super, super important, and it sets candidates apart. But sometimes with a resume, they don't put it in there, and they feel like they're going to talk about it on the interview, which makes sense. They just usually don't get the interview if that resume isn't really up to snuff.
Based on current search activity and pipeline visibility, what does the rest of 2026 look like from your perspective?
We're optimistic. We feel like, things are going in the right direction. Like I said, Q4 was a really good quarter for us. I know it's not at the speed that everybody wants. We've even had recent calls from candidates saying, "Hey, I thought things were really supposed to pop here at the start of February."
Hmm.
And I think, like other people have said, it's measured, but we're very optimistic about it. Now we're kind of like the weather. Q2, I may have a completely different forecast, but
Hmm.
the signs that we're getting, the things that we're hearing, we feel good about it. We think it should be better than the last 2 or 3 years.
This is kind of a repeat of an earlier question, but with a sort of a longer term perspective. Are there roles or capabilities that companies are under investing in today that will become more critical in the next 12 to 18 months?
I can't say about underinvesting, but I go back to analytics, and we just don't have it where they're saying we're looking for a strong analyst. They're asking us for people who are experts in Power BI, who can build dashboards, a lot of market research, Scintilla. And, I think that those are things that, are going to be in the requirements, are going to be looked for, for candidates, over the next 12 to 18 months. I would not be surprised if AI jumps in there. I say we use it, suppliers are using it. I think to some degree, everybody's still trying to figure it out. I would not be shocked at all if AI specific positions are added to teams, relatively soon.
Mike, if someone wants to accurately read the Bentonville supplier market, what signals should they be watching?
One thing that I've always thought was a good signal, it's really the smaller companies. You remember, 20 years ago when all the companies were moving in, and I think now we're starting to see that more, but I think it's a good signal when a company will just, even if it's one person or they're adding to their small team, because a smaller team may not have the resources, but they're pretty thorough in making sure they need that person, that it's filling, some sort of talent gap, or, it's they need that e-com expert or whatever the case may be. But, for us, when we get calls from smaller companies, that's usually a good reflection of, hey, things are picking up, things are looking good here. And, we've had those calls recently, and that's another reason that we're optimistic about what's going to happen this year.
For supplier leaders who want to benchmark their team structure against the broader market, what's the right first step?
That's challenging to benchmark, really against the overall market because the teams are so different. You many times have to compare against someone maybe in your category or same size team, roughly dollar volume, maybe similar SKUs, because it can just vary so much. I would say the first thing though is to evaluate your own team. Look at what's going on there, or do you have the right people? Are the people in the right seats? Are the job descriptions matching what those people are doing? Then you evaluate that, look at any gaps that you have in talent. Then you can go out there and look. And that's something we help with our clients as well. Then you can say, okay, what is another company doing, with this issue? How are they handling omni-channel or whatever the case may be?
And lastly, for anyone navigating transition or personal advancement, what's the best way for someone to engage with you and your team?
Best way is just go to our website to get the ball rolling there, and if we'll get back in touch with them, whether they are looking to hire for their team or they're looking to make a move within the supplier community as a candidate. But the website is the best way to go. We also have some information on there that could be helpful in our blogs that I think could help people if they're in transition, and that'd be the best way to reach out to us, and we'll get back to them as soon as we can.
Yeah, very good.